There's a particular kind of quiet in a truck at the end of a bad day on the water. Not the radio, not the road. It's the quiet where you're privately deciding that maybe you're just not very good at this. 3 hours, one bite that came off at the bank, and a man 40 yards down the shoreline who put 2 in the net while you watched. I've watched anglers carry that verdict home for years, and almost every time, the verdict rested on evidence that could never have supported it. Because a fishing trip takes the water, the weather, the fish, the pressure, your gear, and pure blind chance, and it hands you back one single number: fish landed. That number isn't a report card, it's a rumor. Here are 15 reasons the rumor is wrong. A few you may have heard, most of them you haven't, and one of them is a 20-year experiment in a small Illinois lake that explains why some of the fish in front of you were, in a real and measurable sense, born harder to catch. Let's start with the instrument you've been grading yourself with. Number 1. You're using a broken instrument. A landed fish requires 4 separate things to go right. You have to find a fish, you have to get its attention, you have to get it to commit, and you have to keep it attached. 4 gates. 1 score. When you come home with a 0, that number tells you at least 1 gate closed. It does not tell you which one. And those 4 failures need 4 completely different fixes. Missing gate 1 means you were in the wrong water entirely. Missing gate 4 means you were in exactly the right water, and your hook or your rod angle betrayed you at the last second. Opposite problems. The scoreboard prints them identically. So stop coming home with a number. Come home with a gate. Say it out loud in the truck. I found them, and I couldn't get commitment. That's a sentence you can work with tomorrow. Number 2. You threw away your best data. A follow, a bump, a soft plastic that comes back crushed but empty. That half second of wait before everything goes slack. Most anglers file all of that under nothing happened. It is the exact opposite of nothing. It's a fish telling you that 3 of your 4 gates opened. Muskie fishermen in Wisconsin worked this out generations ago. Joe Bucher spent a career teaching people that the follow at boatside isn't the end of a cast, it's the most information-rich moment of the retrieve. That's where the figure 8 came from. It's a muskie lesson, but the principle belongs to everybody. So count reactions, not fish. 6 follows and no hookups is a completely different day than 6 casts through dead water, and it points at a completely different fix. Nobody sells you a reaction count. There's no shelf space for it. You can't patent noticing. Number 3. You're comparing your whole day to somebody else's best hour. This is where it gets uncomfortable, because there is real data here, and it does not say what you'd expect. Fisheries scientists have spent decades measuring how catch gets distributed among anglers, borrowing the same curve economists use for income inequality. The same lopsided shape keeps appearing: walleye, pike, trout streams, bass lakes. A small slice of anglers accounts for most of the fish, and a very large slice catches nothing at all on a given trip. That much you might have guessed. Here's the part that stops people cold. In 2011, a researcher took those lopsided distributions and tested them against a simple model where catch is determined by nothing except chance and hours on the water. Bass and lake trout logs from 6 Montana lakes. A creel survey from a river in Missouri. The real-world data was not statistically distinguishable from random. Now, that does not mean skill is a myth. I don't believe that, and neither did the man who ran the numbers. It means something narrower and more useful. It means a single trip does not contain enough information to separate a skilled angler from a lucky one. The signal is real. It's just buried under so much noise that one day cannot dig it out. So when you compare your empty stringer to the guy with 2 fish, you are not observing a skill gap. You're observing one sample. He might genuinely be better than you. He might also have simply been standing there. The comparison isn't unfair. It's uninformative, which is worse, and a whole lot easier to put down. Number 4. You judged an entire lake by one piece of shoreline. Fish don't spread out evenly. They clump, sometimes violently so, around bait, around a temperature break, around one submerged stump nobody has ever noticed. Which means your catch rate is a terrible thermometer for how many fish actually live there. A lake can be full and still fish dead for you because you were 80 feet from the wrong stump. Before you write off water, give it one trip where you cover ground instead of soaking. 15 minutes a spot, then move. You're not fishing that day, you're mapping. And check your state and local regulations before you go wandering, because access rules and bank rights vary, sometimes on different ends of the same lake. Number 5. You may be fishing to the survivors. Here's that 20-year experiment. Starting in the 1970s at a small research lake in Illinois called Ridge Lake, biologists ran the most tightly controlled fishing operation you'll ever hear about. Anglers reserved time slots. Every bass caught went into a live well, got measured, tagged, released. Every capture was written down. 4 years of that, thousands of captures. Then they drained the lake and counted everything in it. And what came out of that mud changed how I think about a slow day. Some bass had been caught over and over. One fish came to the boat 16 times in a single year, and right around 200 fish had been in that lake the entire 4 years and had never once been caught. Not by anybody, not on anything. Same water, same anglers, same species. So the researchers took the fish that never bit and bred them together. Then they took the fish that bit constantly and bred those together. Same ponds, same conditions. Then they fished both lines. The difference showed up in the first generation, wider in the second, wider again in the third. Vulnerability to being caught by an angler is a heritable trait. It's written into the fish. The heritability they measured was modest, and this was one population of largemouth bass in one state. Don't carry it further than it goes, but it goes far enough. It means the fish in front of you are not a neutral, average sample of their species. On water hammered for decades, you're casting to a population quietly filtered, by hooks, toward fish that were less willing to bite in the first place. And separate work going back to the 1970s shows individual fish learn to avoid a bait after getting caught on it exactly once. So, 3 things. Stop assuming a refusal is your fault. Some of those fish were never going to eat your bait on a bright August afternoon. Fish the water nobody else fishes, even when it looks worse. That filtering is local. The ugly little pond behind the industrial park has never been filtered. And treat a fish that eats aggressively as the rarity it now is. Work that stretch harder, because willingness clumps up just like fish do. Number 6. You blame the clock when you should be blaming the light. Every angler has a theory about time of day. Most of those theories are actually about light, and light behaves in a way much sharper than morning and evening are better. In a laboratory in 1999, researchers measured how far away lake trout could detect a prey fish across a whole range of light levels. In near darkness, that detection distance was under 10 inches. As light came up, the distance climbed fast, and then it flattened out, hitting roughly 3 feet at a fairly low light level and barely improving after that. Sit with what that means with a lure in the water. That is not a gentle slope, that's a step. Below a certain light level, a fish essentially has to bump into your bait to know it exists. Above it, the fish finds your bait from 3 feet away, and more sunlight doesn't buy you much. That was lake trout in a tank eating live prey, not a bass eating a spinnerbait. Don't over-apply it, but the shape of the curve is the useful part. On the water it means this. In low light, dirty water, or down deep, your problem is not lure color. Your problem is that your bait is invisible from 4 feet away. Slow down. Shorten your casts. Fish the same water twice. Give them something that pushes water or rattles, so finding it doesn't depend on eyesight at all. And in bright, clear conditions, quit crowding them. They saw your bait long before you thought they did. Number 7. You spooked them before your first cast. I've watched more fish lost on the walk-in than on the retrieve. You come over the bank against an open sky. Your shadow slides across the shallows at 8 in the morning, when shadows run 20 feet long. Boots thump on a hollow bank. A tackle box lid slams. Shallow fish in clear water get hunted from above their entire lives. Every heron, every osprey. They don't need to identify you as a threat. They just need to see something large move against the sky. So approach low. Come in with the sun in your face rather than your back when you get the choice. and make your first cast from farther back than feels necessary. The water closest to your boots is very often the best water on that bank, and it's the water most people walk straight through. Number 8. You changed lures when the fish was asking for depth or speed. Here's an opinion that'll irritate about half of you. Changing lures is the most overrated move in fishing. When something isn't working, most anglers reach for a different bait. That changes 6 variables at once: profile, action, sink rate, sound, color, running depth. And it teaches you nothing, because when a fish finally eats, you have no idea which change did it. Meanwhile, the 2 variables that most often matter are the 2 nobody isolates: depth and speed. So keep the lure, change one thing, count the sink, same cast, same spot, count of 3, then 6, then 10, or hold the depth and change the retrieve. Steady, then stop and go, then painfully slow. 9 times out of 10 you'll find your answer before you open the box. The lure company has no reason to tell you that. A counting habit costs nothing and never needs replacing. Number 9. Your lure arrived dead. A lure can travel the entire length of a cast, doing absolutely none of what you bought it for. A blade picks up one strand of grass and quits turning. A soft plastic slides down the shank and folds over on itself. A treble catches the line on the cast and the whole thing swims back sideways. A single leaf covers the hook point. The reel still turns. The rod still loads. It feels productive, but the object that reached those fish was not the object you chose. So once, at the start of every trip, run the lure through clear water right beside you where you can see it. Watch it. Feel it in the rod. That's your baseline. Then anytime the feel changes, lighter, heavier, smoother, pulling to one side, reel it in and look. 10 seconds. That habit separates the fish refused my bait from my bait never showed up. 2 entirely different days, and most people never learn which one they had. Number 10. Your hook point quit before your reflexes did. Hooks hit rock, timber, dock posts, and each other on nearly every retrieve. A point rolls over or flattens while the rest of the hook still looks perfectly fine. Then a fish eats, pressure builds, and that point skates instead of digging in. And you stand there deciding your reaction time is gone when the actual failure was a piece of wire the size of a pencil lead. Secure the lure so it can't swing. Keep the points turned away from your hands. Look at the points straight on. Clean, straight, no shine on the tip, no rust, no bend. And if you know how to do it safely, let it barely touch a thumbnail. It should bite immediately, not slide. If you don't trust it, change it. Hooks cost less than the gas you burned getting there. And notice something. Nobody runs a spring campaign on hook points. There's no new model year. A sharp hook is the cheapest advantage in this sport and the least advertised, because you already own it. Number 11. There was slack in your line you never saw. Wind puts a belly in your line. A high rod tip leaves slack hanging under the tip. Current pushes a bow downstream of your bait. When a fish eats, all of that slack has to come out of the system before 1 ounce of pressure reaches the hook point. And by the time it does, that fish has very often already spit the bait. You felt a bite that didn't stick. What actually happened is that you never applied force to that hook at all. So fix the geometry, not the reflexes. Rod tip lower, pointed toward the bait. Reel down to take the belly out before you sweep. On windy days, drop the tip to the water so the wind has nothing to grab. This matters more as we get older, and I'll be straight about that. Reaction time does slow down. Line management does not. A clean, tight line will outperform fast hands every time, and unlike fast hands, you can simply decide to do it. Number 12. You fished water you could see instead of water you could work. There's a beautiful laydown out there. You can see it plain as day. But from where you're standing, your line crosses 2 branches, drags your bait back out of the pocket, and if a fish did eat, you'd have no path to bring it anywhere. You look like you're fishing good cover. Your bait spends almost no time behaving normally near it. So before you cast, trace the route backward. Can the bait land clean? Does your line have a lane? And if a fish eats, where does it run? And can you follow it? Move down the bank until the geometry works, even if the cast gets shorter. A short cast into workable water beats a hero cast into a place you can't fight a fish. Number 13. You fished the same hour every trip and called it a pattern. Most of us fish when life allows. Saturday morning, after work, which means your entire dataset comes from one narrow slice of the day, one narrow slice of the light, often one narrow slice of the wind. Then a lake looks dead to you for 3 years. And it isn't dead. It's dead at 10 in the morning. So change one variable per trip and write it down. 3 lines on your phone. Time in, time out. What the fish did. 6 trips of that will teach you more about your home water than 6 new baits ever will. Which, again, is exactly why nobody markets it to you. Number 14. You never let the water rest. An angler finds a good-looking spot and plants himself in it for 4 straight hours, casting into the same 15 feet of water. But think about what you just told those fish. Over and over, you demonstrated that a specific object moves through their space and is not food. They learn that fast. And the pressure isn't only yours. It stacks on everybody who fished it before you. Fisheries researchers have a name for what sustained angling pressure does to a population's behavior. The short version is that the bold fish get removed or educated, and what's left behaves more cautiously. So rotate. 3 spots, 20 minutes apiece, then come back around. The spot that was dead on your first pass is very often the best one on the third, and it cost you nothing to find out. Number 15. You bought confidence instead of building it. This is the one that costs the most, and the one nobody names out loud. When you have a bad day, the industry offers a very specific cure. A new bait, a new color, a new rod promising sensitivity nobody can measure, an appealing trade, money for certainty, and it works for about 1 trip. The trouble is that everything on the list you just heard is unsellable. A gate diagnosis, a reaction count, a sink count, a 10-second lure check, a sharp hook, a lower rod tip, a rotation, a notebook. None of it can be patented. None of it comes out in a new color next spring. None of it needs a spot on a shelf. That isn't a conspiracy. It's arithmetic. A company sells what it can manufacture. This simply has nobody to pay for its advertising. And if you want proof the gear was never really the point, it's been in the record books for over 90 years. June 1932, Georgia. A young farmer named George Perry couldn't work his fields because they were too wet, so he and a friend went out on a backwater oxbow off the Ocmulgee River in a homemade boat. Between them they had 1 rod, 1 reel, and 1 lure. A creek chub fintail shiner. They took turns. One man sculled while the other cast. Perry caught a largemouth bass that weighed 22 pounds, 4 ounces. It stood alone as the world record for 77 years, and it has never been beaten, only matched. Then he took it home and his family ate it, because it was 1932, and that was the entire point of going fishing. 1 rod, 1 lure, shared with another man. I'm not telling you to throw out your tackle. I like tackle. I'm telling you the causal arrow does not point the direction the catalog says it points. So here's where all 15 of these land. You are probably not bad at fishing, but you also can't be certain you're good at it, and that's the honest version. 1 trip doesn't carry enough information to prove anything in either direction. What it carries is a gate that closed, and a reaction that either happened or it didn't. That's a much smaller question than, am I any good at this? And it's the only one you can actually answer. So the next time you're sitting in that truck at the end of a quiet day, don't run the verdict, run the gates. Name the one that closed. Notice whether anything out in that water reacted to you at all. Because a bad day and a day you didn't read are the same thing, right up until you read it. I'd rather drive home carrying a question than a verdict. A question you can bring back to the water. A verdict just sits there. Now I want to hear from you, and I want the real answer, not the polite one. Which of the 4 gates closes on you the most? Finding them, getting attention, getting commitment, or keeping them attached? And what's the piece of advice everybody on your local water repeats that you've quietly stopped believing? I want to hear the heresy. And whatever you do out there, check your state and local regulations before you go. They change, they vary from one body of water to the next, and they are nobody's job but yours.